Hi everyone, my name is Brittany J. Jones. Due to Mimi G's schedule, she has asked me to step in to record the sew-alongs for her new Simplicity patterns, Simplicity 8994, as well as Simplicity 8985. In this video, we'll be sewing along with view C of Simplicity 8994. So let's go ahead and review the pattern pieces that we need to cut out, and then we can begin sewing. The first pattern piece that we need to cut out is piece 20. This is our under collar. We need to cut one on the fold of fabric and one on the fold of interfacing. Pattern piece number 19, this is the upper collar. We need one on the fold of fabric and one on the fold of interfacing. Pattern piece 16, this is the flap. We need two of fabric, two of lining, and two of interfacing. Pattern piece 22, this is the sleeve band, and we need to cut two. Pattern piece 18, this is the lower band, and we need to cut one on the fold. Pattern piece 15, this is the pocket, we need to cut two. Pattern piece 14, this is the front, and we need to cut two. Pattern piece 23, this is the front lining, and we need to cut two. Pattern piece 17, this is the back. We need to cut one on the fold of fabric and one on the fold of lining. And pattern piece 21, we need to cut two of fabric and two of lining. If you need any fabric suggestions, on the back of the pattern envelope, they have a list of fabrics that will work perfect for all the views on this pattern. Once you have your pattern pieces cut out, your fabric, and you transferred all your markings, let's start sewing. To begin working on the jacket, we're going to start working on piece number 1. And the first thing that we want to do is go to the machine and do a row of stay stitching along the neck edge. I've done mine right here. I've stay stitched it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And while you're there doing the stay stitch, you also want to reinforce this inner circle right here. We want to stay stitch on both sides of the dart. So I just started here about 1 inch away. I stitched to the dart and then I pivoted and then I stitched 1 inch down. Once you have that reinforced, we can go ahead and clip up to this circle, being sure not to clip through the stitching. So go ahead and do your stay stitching around the neck edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and also reinforce this inner circle and then clip to it. Next, we can put our front piece to the side and start working on our pocket. For our pocket, we're going to go to the ironing board and we're going to press under 1/4 inch along the upper edge of the pocket. So let's go ahead and press this down now. Once you have it pressed, now we're going to turn it over to the right side and fold it down along the fold line. I put 2 clips on the side to notate where my fold line is. So let's go ahead and fold down along the fold line and press. All right, now that we have the facing of the pocket pressed down, we can go to the machine now and we can stitch along the sides, the lower edge, as well as the other side along the seam line at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that we have the pocket sewn along the seam line, we can go ahead and trim up here along the facing at a 1/4 inch. Before we flip it right side out, we're going to go ahead and create the darts on the lower end of our pocket. So we're going to put it together right sides facing. You should have transferred these markings down here. These are the darts that we're going to create on our pocket. So we're going to bring it right sides facing. Grab my pins and we're going to pin through just as we would a dart. Make sure that you're going through both of the dart legs and pin in place. Right sides together. Put your pin in through both of the dart legs. So now we can go to our sewing machine. You want to begin stitching here, and we're going to stitch along the lines, and once you get to the end, we're not going to back stitch, we're going to tie a knot. So back stitch at the beginning, but tie a knot once you get to the point. So let's go ahead and stitch the darts on the end of our pocket and do it for both of your pockets. Back stitch at the beginning of your stitch, and remember to tie a knot at the end. Once you have your dart stitched in place, you want to go ahead and stitch the other 3 darts the same way. Now that we have the darts sewn on the bottom of our pocket, now we can go ahead and flip it right side out. If you need your point turner, you can go ahead and grab it. And now let's go ahead and press. So I'm going to press down the pocket facing. And now I'm going to press along that stitching line that we made all the way along our pocket. So let's just fold that in and press along that stitching line. For the dart, I'm going to open it up to press it flat. Depending on the type of fabric that you are using, if it's lightweight, you can press your darts going toward the center, but my fabric is a little heavy, so I'm just going to keep them pressed open like this. Once you have the darts pressed, you can continue pressing in along that seam line. Now that you have the raw edges pressed in along that seam line, now we can go to the machine and we can stitch right here along this facing, right along the fold. So I'm going to stitch with my fabric facing up toward the needle like this, and I'm just going to follow along the fold. So let's go ahead and stitch down this facing right along this inner fold now. I'm using my finger here as a guide to feel where the fold is, and I'm just stitching right along it. Alright, now that we have the pocket facing stitched down and we've pressed up the raw edges, now we can go ahead and pin it onto our front. So here's my front piece here. And I have transferred my placement lines. They were on the back, but I've transferred them to the front so I can see. So now I'm just going to match up my markings and pin my pocket in place, making sure that I have this folded edge right along the placement line. So definitely make sure that you transfer your entire placement line for the pocket so we can stitch right along it. Grab some pins and let's pin it in place. Alright, now that we have our pocket pinned in place, we can go to the sewing machine. We can begin stitching here at the top. Make sure that you back stitch, and we're going to stitch right along this folded edge, making sure that you stay along the placement line. So we're going to stitch along the side, the lower edge, and the other side. Make sure that you back stitch up here as well. So let's go ahead and stitch on our pocket now. Once you have the pocket sewn on, now we can start working on the flap. You should have cut 2 of fabric, 2 of lining, and 2 of interfacing. So this right here is my fabric, and I've gone ahead and fused it with one of the interfacing ones. And this right here is my lining, so I'm going to put right sides facing. And I'm going to pin along the side edges and the lower edge. Once you have it pinned, now we can go to the machine and stitch it in a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, being sure to leave this edge open up here at the top. So let's go ahead and stitch it in place now. Now let's go ahead and trim our seam. All right, now that we have the flap sewn, I'm going to go ahead and trim. I'm also going to put some clips right here along the curve. Now that we have it trimmed, let's go ahead and give it a good press. Now that you have it pressed, we can go to the machine and we can baste at a 3/8 of an inch on the raw edge. So let's go ahead and baste it now. All right, now that we have basted the raw edges at a 3/8 of an inch, now we can go ahead and pin it onto the front. You should have transferred your placement line for your flap. You want to line up this basting stitch with the placement line and pin it in place. Once you have it pinned, now we can go to the machine and we can stitch it right along this basting stitch now. Go ahead and stitch on your flap the same way. Once we have the flap stitched on, we can go ahead and trim close to the stitching. Alright, once we have trimmed the flap, you want to go ahead and press it down. Now we can go to the machine and we can do a top stitch at a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the flap, being sure to catch in this raw edge right here. So let's go ahead and do our top stitching now. Alright, once you have your flap sewn on, you want to go ahead and do your other front the same way, and then we can move on to the next step. Next, we're going to go ahead and put our front and back right sides facing. And we're going to pin at our shoulder and side seams. Make sure that you match up your notches and pin in place. Alright, once you have it all pinned, we can go to the machine. We can stitch our shoulders and side seams at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have the shoulder seams and side seams sewn, we can go ahead and press them open. Alright, now that we have our shoulder seams and side seams pressed, now we can go ahead and attach our lower band. Alright, here is my lower band, and we're going to pin it onto the jacket, matching up our notches and the small dots that we've transferred. So let's go ahead and pin in place. I'm going to start in the back with my notches, and we will need to stretch the band to fit. So with right side spacing, go ahead and pin in place. Alright, now that we have it pinned, we can go to the machine and we can stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Be sure once you get here that you pivot once you get to this circle, and continue stitching all the way around, and then get here at this circle and pivot and stitch down. But let's go ahead and stitch on our lower band now. Once you have your band sewn on, you want to go ahead and press your seams up toward the jacket. So let's go ahead and press our seams now. Now that we have our lower band sewn on, now we can start working on our zipper. So the first thing that you want to do is go ahead and grab your zipper, and first you want to measure it from both of the large circles. You should have transferred 2 large circles along the front edge. Go ahead and measure your zipper, make sure that it is between these large circles. So here's my zipper right here, and I measured my zipper from the bottom zipper here to the top, and as you can see, it is too long. Now this is a 22-inch zipper, and it goes past this marking up here, so I have to shorten my zipper. So I've already started to shorten it to the length that I want it to be. So this is how I shorten my zipper. Here are the little zipper teeth that I had to remove, and I use these tools right here. Don't judge my tools, y'all. These are the tools that I use to take the teeth, the metal teeth off of the zipper tape. So I just wanted to show you that these are the teeth right here, and I'm going to show you how I did it. So I marked where I need my zipper to stop at, and we can't just cut it off right here because we need some excess zipper up here like they have here, so we'll be able to fold it into the seam allowance and stitch it in place. And we also don't want to ever sew over metal teeth because it could break our needle and possibly damage our machine. So we need to remove it. So I grabbed this tool here. I don't know the proper name for it, but I grabbed this tool, and first I gave it a twist, and I pulled it off. So it does take a little bit of arm muscle, but it can be done. So again, I just grabbed here, twisted a little bit, and pull the teeth off. So if you need to shorten your zipper, go ahead and mark exactly where you want it to stop at, and you want to remove the teeth above it. Now, for the last zipper tooth, you need to keep that because we need to reapply that so the zipper will stop there. So I kept mine. I have the big portion of it over here. So once I get down to where my pin is, I will reapply this one so that the zipper will stop where I need it to stop. So again, I'm just going to remove the zipper teeth on this side. All right, now that I have shortened down the other side, now I just need to put the top stop back on. So I have it here. So now I can go ahead and put this back on. When I took this off, I used this tool to kind of get up under it to lift it, and that helped. So now I'm just going to put it back on. One more squeeze just to be sure. All right, so I just shortened my zipper. Now I'm going to zip it up, just a moment of truth. All right, now we're good to go. So now let's go ahead and continue to install our zipper. All right, to go ahead and install our zipper, I'm gonna take our zipper right here. We want the portion of the zipper with the zipper pull on it, this portion right here, to go face down on the right side of the zipper. And we want to line up the bottom of the zipper with our circle at the bottom. I'm going to grab some pins and pin that in place. And we want to line up the top of our zipper with this large circle here, and I'm going to pin that in place as well. Depending on the type of fabric that you are using, and if your zipper is heavy, then you might want to go ahead and fuse a thin strip of interfacing right behind where your zipper will be installed at. My fabric I'm using here is a twill, so it has a nice weight to it, but I want to just go ahead and apply a thin strip of interfacing just to add more stability for the zipper. So just continue pinning your zipper 1/4 inch away from the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and pin the other portion of the zipper on the same way. You want it to be face down. Line up the bottom of the zipper with your large dot at the bottom and have the zipper 1/4 inch away from the edge and pin it in place. Alright, now that you have both sides of the zipper pinned on, you have them face down, you've matched them up to your large circles, and you have it 1/4 inch away from the edge. Let's go ahead and baste it in place. I've gone ahead and attached my zipper foot on here, so now I'm just going to baste the zipper in place. Go ahead and baste the other side of your zipper on the same way. Now that we have the zipper basted in place, we want to go ahead and zip it up and make sure that everything is matching, the zipper is even. Alright, so this looks really good. We want to go ahead and stitch it in place, and we want to make sure that we are stitching it in place 5/8 inch from this raw edge here. So let's go to our machine and go ahead and stitch our zipper in place, and again making sure that we are on a 5/8 inch seam allowance. For the excess of the zipper up here, you want to make sure that you have this folded in facing toward the raw edge, so once we have it sewn down and we attach our lining, we can trim this off. So let's go ahead now and stitch our zipper in place using a regular machine stitch. Alright, once you have your zipper sewn in place, you can go ahead and zip it closed, and we can put this to the side to start working on our collar. To begin working on our collar, you want to go ahead and grab your piece 19, which is your upper collar, and piece 20 is your under collar. Go ahead and apply interfacing for both of them. For piece 19, you want to do gathering stitches along the side and lower edge of it. I've gone ahead and done my gathering stitches here. And once you have the gathers on the upper collar, again, this is pattern piece 19, we go ahead and put it right sides facing. And we can pin it in place, and we can pull up on the gathering stitches to ease it in around the curves. Alright, once you have it all pinned, we can go to the machine and we can stitch it at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now that we have it stitched, we want to go ahead and trim our seams. Alright, now that we have it trimmed, now we want to go back to the machine and do understitching on the under collar. So you want to make sure that you have the seam facing toward the under collar, which is piece 20. And you want to go ahead and do understitching as far as you can go. Now, depending on the type of fabric that you are using, if you're using faux fur or a Sherpa, you can omit this step, but I am using a twill, so I'm going to go ahead and do understitching now. Alright, now that we have our collar understitched, I have done my understitching on the under collar. I've pressed it, and I also basted the raw edges together here at the top. So now we can go ahead and pin the collar onto our jacket. So with right sides facing, you want to make sure that you have the under collar facing onto the jacket. We're going to match up our notches and our circles. The small circles here, they line up with the shoulder seams. So let's go ahead and pin in place. If you need more ease around your collar, you can clip down to the stay stitching, but don't clip past your stay stitching stitch. Once you have it pinned, now we can go ahead and baste it in place. All right, now that we have our collar basted on, we can go ahead and put the jacket to the side and start to work on our sleeves. To begin working on our sleeve, we're going to put 2 rows of gathering stitches along the upper edge of the sleeve, and I went from notch to notch with my 2 rows of gathering stitches. The first one is at 5/8 of an inch, and the second stitch I did 1/4 of an inch away from it, all in the seam allowance. So go ahead and do your gathering stitches here along the upper edge of your sleeve, and with the gathering stitch you want to use the longest stitch on your machine, which is the basting stitch, and for my machine it's a 5.0. So adjust your machine and go ahead and do your gathering stitches now. Once you have your gathering stitches in, we can go ahead and put the sleeve right sides facing. You want to match up your notch, and we're going to pin in place. All right, now that we have the sleeve pinned, we're going to go to the machine and we're going to stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Let's go ahead and do that now. Remember to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch. Now we can go ahead and press this seam open. Now that we have the seam pressed, now we can grab the sleeve band. I'm going to grab my sleeve band. I'm going to put it right sides facing. You should have transferred a notch right here. I'm going to pin in place. All right, now we can go to the machine and you want to stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that I have my band sewn, I'm going to open out the seam. I'm going to fold it with wrong sides facing. So this should be the right side of your band here. Make sure that you match up these notches. Once you have it with the right size of the band out, we can go ahead and pin it to the lower edge of the sleeve. If you need to, you can put a basting stitch around this raw edge of the band to keep the layers together. With right sides facing, I'm going to slip the band over the sleeve. I'm going to match up the center seam with the band with the seam of my sleeve and pin in place. And now I'm going to find my notches and match those up as well and pin in place. And now we can stretch the sleeve band to fit the sleeve. All right, once you have it pinned, now we can go to the machine and stitch this at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. To attach the sleeve band to the sleeve, I'm going to stitch it in a circle, having the right side of my fabric touching my machine. So I'm going to slip it under the presser foot like so. I'm going to line it up with the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. Alright, now that we have our sleeve band sewn onto our sleeve, now we can go ahead and insert our sleeve into our jacket. For the sleeve, you want to match up your notches, so you should have transferred 2 notches on one side and 1 notch on the other. The single notch goes to the front of the jacket, the double notches goes to the back. First, I'm going to line up the side seam of my jacket with the seam of my sleeve and pin in place. Then I'm going to bring it to the inside. Like so. You should have transferred some markings on your jacket as well as on your sleeve. Those will line up. So now I'm going to go ahead and pull on my gathering stitches to ease in the sleeve. All right, now that we have our sleeve pinned, we can go to the sewing machine and we can stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then we're going to stitch again 1/8 of a way from that seam, but make sure that you're still in the seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do our stitching now. All right, now that you have your sleeve sewn, you want to go ahead and do your other sleeve the exact same way, and then we can go on and start working on our lining. To construct our lining, we are going to sew it the same way that we did for our jacket. So you want to do stay stitching along the neck edge of your front and back piece at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You want to stitch your shoulder seams together right sides facing, and you also want to sew your side seams together right sides facing. However, on one of your side seams, you want to make sure that you leave an opening so that once we have the lining sewn onto the jacket, we'll be able to flip the jacket out right sides facing. And to do this, you just want to stitch down. You can put a pin in place so you know where you want to stop at. Make sure that you back stitch there, leave an opening, and then pick back up, stitching here, back stitch, and stitch down the remainder of the side seam. The amount that you want to leave open on your side seam is up to you. You just want it to be enough that you can pull your entire jacket through once the lining is sewn to it. So again, you want to do the stay stitching along the neck edge of your front and back piece. You want to sew your shoulder seams, sew down your side seams, leave an opening in one of the side seams, and then you also want to go ahead and install your sleeves the same exact way that we did for our jacket. So go ahead and construct your lining, and then we can move on to the next step. Next, we're going to stitch our lining to the lower band of our jacket. So I'm going to put my jacket right sides facing. And so this lower edge of the band, we're going to put our lining right sides facing to the jacket. We're going to match up our notches. The circles on our lower band, they match up to the side seams on our lining. So let's go ahead and pin it in place now. All right, now that we have the lining pinned onto the lower edge of the band, we can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And again, this is right sides facing. So let's go ahead and stitch our lining to our band now. Make sure that you back stitch at the beginning and the end. And once again, this is a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, now that we have the lower edge of our band sewn onto our lining, now we can go ahead and pin the remainder of our lining along our front opening edges as well as our neck edge. So let's go ahead and line everything up, right sides facing, and begin pinning in place. Down here at the lower edge, our band, it will fold in half, and I transferred a marking right here where my fold line was. So it's gonna fold right at the end of that zipper stop. Your band should fold in half and pin in place. You want to match up your notches and your large circles. Make sure that you have the excess portion of the zipper facing out toward the raw edges so that when we sew it, we'll be able to clip off the excess once it's sewn. Match up your circles and continue pinning in place. If you need to clip down to your stay stitching to get more ease, you can clip, but be sure not to go past your stay stitching. All right, now that we have our lining pinned onto our jacket, right sides facing, first we're going to go to the machine and we're going to stitch right along the neck edge at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once we have the neck edge sewn, then we're going to change out to our zipper foot, and then we're going to stitch a 1/2 inch along the front opening edges. So first let's go ahead and stitch at a 5/8 of an inch along the neck edge, and then a 1/2 inch along the front opening edge along the zipper. To sew on our lining to our neck edge, I'm going to begin stitching in the middle and stitch to one end, and then come back to the middle and stitch to the other. I've already stitched down this end, so I'm back in the center now, and I'm going to stitch down to the other side. And once I get over here to around the zipper, I'm just going to use my hand to turn the hand wheel because I don't want to accidentally sew over the metal top stop up here. So let's go ahead and stitch on the lining to the neck edge at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Be sure to back stitch here at the beginning and the end of your stitch. Okay, I'm going to start using my hand wheel to just turn it manually. There's my top stop right there, so I need to adjust a little bit. All right, now that we have the lining sewn along our neck edge as well as our front edge, we can go ahead and trim our corners as well as the neck edge now. All right, now that we have the neck edge trimmed, I also trimmed away the excess portion of my zipper. Now we need to anchor our lower band seams together. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring these seams down here together, the seam with the lower band in the fabric and the seam with the lower band in the facing. We're going to bring it together. The band should be wrong sides facing, and we're only working with the seam allowances. So make sure that you have your band out of the way. We don't want to catch that. And you're just going to match up your notches and not match up your side seams and pin in place. So again, I am moving the band out of the way, and I'm only working on the seam allowances, bringing them together, and it should be wrong sides facing, and I'm pinning in place. All right, now that we have it all pinned together, and again, we're just anchoring our lower band seams together. You should only have your seams pinned, not your lower band, so just make sure of that. Now we can go to the machine and we can stitch this in a 1/2 inch seam allowance as far as we can go. So I'll probably just start right here at the notch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance and just stitch all the way down along the lower band. So let's go ahead and do that now. Back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch, and once again, this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, so I just anchored the lower bands together. So now we can go ahead and pull our jacket right side out through the opening that we left in our lining. So let's go ahead and pull it through now. All right, now that we have the lining in, you want to go ahead and give everything a really good press. All right, now that we have the lining and the jacket fabric all turned right side out, the next step is to go ahead and attach our sleeve lining down here to our seam. So I have already done this one right here, and it looks like this. Looks a little confusing, so I'm going to walk you through the steps. You want to go ahead and make sure that you have your sleeve lining in your sleeve. So I have my lining right here. I'm going to fold back the sleeve band so that only the seam allowance is showing. So here's the seam allowance right here from our band and our jacket. So now I'm going to take my lining and I'm going to fold it in about 5/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to take this seam right here from the sleeve band in the jacket. I'm going to fold under 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to meet those together like so. So again, here's the sleeve lining. I folded under 5/8 of an inch, and working on the seam allowance of the band and the jacket only, I folded in along that seam line, and I'm going to grab a pin and I'm going to pin that in place like so. So now we're going to reach in through our opening that we left in our jacket. All right, so here's my hand here. I'm going to grab onto this seam and I'm going to pull it through. All right, so here is the portion that I just pulled through. I can let go of it now because it's pinned in place, but I'm just going to hold on to these seam allowances here. I'm going to remove the pin. So now we should be holding on to our seam allowances. So now we're going to pin this in place along the seam allowances. It should be right sides facing, and we're going to pin it in this circular motion here. So just match up the seam allowances and pin in place. Stretching the band to fit for the lining. Match up your notch. All right, so once you're done pinning, it should look similar to this. So now we can take it to the machine and we can go ahead and stitch it all together at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that now. Remember to back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch, and we're just going around in a circular motion to stitch the sleeve lining to the band in the jacket. Alright, once you have your sleeves sewn, I trimmed down my seam just a little bit. So now we can go ahead and pull everything right side out. And you should have a nice lined sleeve. Alright, now that we have our sleeves all done, the last thing for us to do is to go ahead and slip stitch our opening clothes, and then we're all done with our jacket.